Bob, for people who want to reinvent themselves and create their dream life, why is mastering psychology and communication so important to do so?
Yeah, such a great question, Doug. I think that the psychology piece is really a big piece of knowing yourself. And if you're going to reinvent yourself, you have to know yourself. And then I think on the communication piece, right, particularly around dealing with conflict, dealing with difficult conversations, I think part of the reinvention is really seeing conflict as an opportunity for growth, an opportunity for transformation, both internally, because I think a lot of ways in which we often get stuck is we have these internal conflicts we don't deal with. But then I would just say across that proverbial negotiation table, um, where we often find ourselves kind of avoidant because we think conflict is something that's bad or to be eliminated or to be avoided. And so I think the rethinking that actually opens up opportunities for real connection and really building relationships that matter.
Yeah, and when you talk about conflict, one of the words that gets thrown in there at times is boundaries. And we also are talking about communication here. Like, what are some of your communication hacks when you're dealing with conflict so that people can command respect and set boundaries with somebody else or themselves without like being disrespectful?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I have found in the consulting work that I do and the coaching and teaching work that I do is that often we can code our own needs, our own interests, as sometimes as selfish, as sometimes as being too demanding, or we just might say things like it's not that important, or it matters more to them than it matters to us. All of those internal stories actually prevent us from setting up the boundaries that we need. They prevent us from being effectively assertive. So the hack that I would say is there's this pre-work. The pre-work is saying, what are the reasons why this is important for me? What are the reasons why I really want to raise this? And then what are the reasons why it's not worth it or I'm afraid? The hack is then to say your job in that conversation is to give both of those sides equal voice. Um, because oftentimes what we do is internally we just kind of stuff down the side that is maybe thinks we might have something to say, but we're not sure. We then please the other person, right? Violating a boundary. And then we're kind of on the pillow being haunted by the side of ourselves that was like, why didn't you speak up? Or why did you let them do that? Or why did you get taken advantage of? And so there's this just ability to do the pre-work and then in the room to say both of these sides need to get voiced, and that's okay.
How can somebody like effectively do that? Let's like walk through a real life example in that. Let's just say, there's two people. Let's just say they're at the workplace. Let's just say it's their boss. Their boss is like, "Hey, I need you to like work an extra hour today." And the person's like, "Hey, like I have plans with my family that I've had for the last month." The boss is like, "I don't care. Like you're my employee. You report to me. Like you have to do it." How can the employee navigate that situation in a way where they're being assertive and getting and essentially get what they want?
Yeah. So Doug, I think I'm going to kind of answer your question, which is how do you do it in the moment. And then I think there's also a different conversation if there's a dynamic around this about how you might handle it. So I think in the moment, right, which is, of course, we all want that skill to be able to do this well. But the first thing you need to do, which is probably the hardest thing, is take a pause. Um, Actually breathe. Um, and that may sound maybe touchy-feely or strange, but there's a lot of brain science around that. Because in that pause, in that breathing, and not almost, in fact, naming to ourselves the anxiety we might be feeling, the anger, the frustration we might be feeling. That's called affective labeling. So there's a guy at UCLA by the name of Matt Lieberman who's done a lot of work on this, right? That when we kind of take the pause and name those feelings to ourselves, it actually reduces the amount of time it takes for us to have an emotional response, which might be like, yes, ma'am, or yes, sir, to a more purposeful response. Second thing I would say is there is and this may sound counterintuitive to some, there is a listening piece before there's an assertiveness piece. So the listening piece is actually to kind of hear, what is this boss saying? It seems like there's something urgent. It's really important that this gets done, right? To reflect that back to them. Because I think if you immediately go into the I have plans tonight, it's set up as a win-lose. And that is not inviting to anybody. And frankly, the boss is probably more likely going to win, right? Because the boss has more power. So you want to just say, I heard the need. Then the next thing is, instead of to turn it into a us versus them, you want to turn it into a joint problem. So how do you do that? You say, so it sounds like, the client wants this tomorrow morning at 9, and it's really important for me to work on this. At the same time, I have tickets to the Bruins tonight or whatever. You might not say the Bruins, but I have some kind of commitment. And then you name both needs, and they're both important. And then you say, I wonder how we could problem solve around this. So why is that important, right? Because you are, first of all, leveling the relationship. Secondly, you're enlisting the boss in a positive role. Because one way you can make the boss feel is, you're the overlord who's ruining my plans. No one wants to, we know psychologically, when you put someone in a crummy role, they revolt against it. But now I'm actually saying, we have a shared problem, and you, boss, might have some ideas on how to problem solve around it. Now, of course, I could say, yeah, I have a solution. You're going to work tonight, so sorry. I mean, they might do that, right? But then the next move is to say, so that's one way of solving it. Can we spend a few more minutes thinking it through? By the way, I would say half of the time, the boss probably doesn't have it as an urgent need at 9 a.m. They've just decided that's the path of least resistance. If it really is an urgent need at 9 a.m., then you're going to have to probably figure it out somehow, problem solving. And if it isn't that, just standing up for yourself in a way that doesn't put the boss in a role is not escalatory, but it's also setting that boundary in a way that's, I think, respectful and shows you're a good listener.
You're talking about authority here, like the boss has more power, etc. What is a conversation technique that people can use that could instantly boost their perceived authority, so they don't come across as being insecure, weak, or unsure of themselves?
Yeah. Okay. It's such a great question. So whenever a question I so often get is what happens when I don't have power, or what happens when I'm the lower power person? I think the first thing in that is to say that if you're in a negotiation, if you're in a workplace, both you and the boss has some sources of power, because the boss wants you to do something or not do something. The person with authority wants you to do something or not do something. That means they need to influence you in some way, that you have something to offer. So I say that because if you don't believe that, you will never have any confidence. Because you're coming from a place of, I have nothing to bring and nothing to offer. So I just think belief is the first important piece to actual action, right? I think the second thing I would say in this is that, and this is a kind of, probably many of your guys who come from a negotiation background would say this, that the task here is to get that higher power person out of thinking about this in power terms and more thinking about what are their interests. Because if you can get them to think about what their interests are, there's an opportunity by shifting from power dynamics to kind of underlying needs and concerns that just take it from a zero-sum win-lose into something that is better for the higher power person and better for you. And so the other hack in this, right, it's not even a hack, it's just a basic but really hard thing to do, is really, really good listening. So whenever someone comes at you with something that feels like a demand, or feels like a take it or leave it, or feels like this expires, in 2 hours, to think about, well, what's actually driving that? So I can give you just an example, Doug. Like when we were negotiating our book contract, at some point there was this like midnight, this midnight decision point. And I was like, well, what is it like? What is it about midnight? Like, help me understand that. Now, we were first time authors, right? And this was a major publishing house, HarperCollins. Like, they had all the power. But just that move, the first answer was, well, that's how we always do it. Or like they said, well, we need to get a decision sooner or later. Okay, absolutely. But what is it about midnight? Because the interest is resolving this efficiently. And that's shared. We want to resolve it efficiently too. But what is it about midnight? And once they couldn't answer that, they're like, oh, yeah, you could have the weekend. So the point is, right, interest is efficiency. Position is do it Friday night at midnight. And that inquiry piece, if there's something real, they'll tell you. And if it's real, you're going to have to solve for it. Otherwise, it's just a power move.
So taking this one step further, like what do you think is like a hidden mistake that people make that instantly like lower their their negotiating power when in conversation with somebody they're trying to either get something from, or they're trying to kind of level the playing field a bit?
Yeah. So I think that they see things very quickly in a win-lose, either or term. So seeing in binary is probably the biggest mistake. And then I think the second mistake is that they allow themselves to fall into a default emotional response. So in our book, we talk about one of 5 F's: fight, flight, freeze, fawn, or fester. And all of us have our brain immediately goes to one of these defaults, whether or not that's actually one that would be useful or productive in the moment.
So when it comes to like conflict and having these difficult conversations that we're talking about, I think what can be really challenging for people is when somebody is being passive aggressive or manipulative. Like, how do you navigate a conversation with somebody who's difficult without losing your cool?
Yeah, this is such a hard challenge. So a few things that I want to say. First, I really appreciate that you said, how do you handle a conversation with someone who's difficult, as opposed to a difficult person? Because I think that, are there people who are inherently difficult in the universe? For sure. The vast majority of the time, when we're experiencing someone as difficult, they're doing unhelpful behaviors, but they are not inherently difficult. I think that distinction is important because it enables us to respond to the behavior and try to see past that behavior. So how do you do that? I think in the moment, what you ought to be trying to do is really trying to take them at face value. So we often will say, oh, they're being passive aggressive. But I'll try to actually take all the pieces of what they're saying and test it. So it sounds like this is important, and this is important, and this is important. Because if each of those 3 things are important, then they're going to engage with you. And if one of them was distraction or designed to throw you off balance, once you name it and try to take it seriously, they can't persist in the impossible behavior. And if they do persist, the way they do that is they usually shift to something else. And as soon as they shift to something else, if they do that 2 or 3 times, that enables me to then say, before we continue talking about whatever, the work project or the schedule for implementation, I think we should have a conversation about our dynamic. So I think we often have a hesitancy to going meta on these like hard conversations, we're fighting about the thing, but actually the thing we need to have the conversation about is the way we're having the conversation. The other thing I would just say about these kinds of conversations is that the best time to have them isn't actually at the moment that they're being passive aggressive. In other words, if I'm dealing with someone who's repeatedly experiences passive aggressive or difficult or elusive or non-responsive, what I really want to do is actually find some time to talk to them about that dynamic at a moment when I'm actually feeling more confident and capable and ready to listen, and where they're not already like, in some kind of turmoil doing the behavior. And so that means finding a time that works for both of you, signaling what it's going to be about. And it doesn't need to be done in a threatening way or in, an accusatory way. It shouldn't be done that way. It will feel awkward, right? Because sometimes people say to me, oh, well, how do you do that without it feeling awkward? Well, you don't. It's going to be awkward. But like lots of things in life are uncomfortable. It's like if you want to like run a marathon, the moment from beginning your training to running the marathon, there's a lot of discomfort in there, but that's how you get to the marathon. So I don't have an answer to how to do that without it being uncomfortable. But I do have an answer of how you could increase the likelihood to be successful.
How can somebody tell if they're like being manipulated? Like, how can somebody protect themselves from being manipulated by somebody during conversations?
Yeah. So I think the more when you're in one of these hard negotiations or difficult conversations, you are working really hard to get them to move past what seems like a bargaining position to what's really important to them. And if they continue to feel elusive, right, you think you've identified it. So just to use that example we were using earlier, you know, we really need a quick answer. We want a speedy answer on whether you want to write your book with us as a publisher. If they're sincere about that, they're probably not going to make much difference between whether it is Friday at midnight or Monday morning on a decision. But if they move then to something else and move to something else and move to something else, that's a sense that you're being manipulated. The other thing, though, I would say, Doug, on this, and this goes back to preparation, is really knowing what your own bottom lines are, what your must-haves are, and not being afraid to walk away. And you don't want to walk away from a position of anger. You don't want to walk away from a position of like frustration. But you do want to walk away if what someone's offering you isn't as good as what you can get away from them. And the only way you actually know that is by doing the pre-work of understanding what's important to you. And if I walk away, what's on offer? Because if you don't know what that is, then you can never make a decision of whether I should stay here or not.
Yeah, how can somebody give me an example of like, let's just say somebody thinks they're being manipulated or conned or whatever. Like, what's something they can say to somebody that sounds respectful, maintains authority, but they're not coming across as overly emotional when ending the conversation?
So if I'm in a conversation, I feel like I'm being manipulated. The generic advice is to express how you're experiencing it without making that attribution of intentionality. So what might that look like? It might be to say, one thing that's very important for me in our conversations is to know that I'm being treated fairly, and to know that the two of us have clear and direct conversation. And one thing I'm worrying about or having a concern with is whether both of those are happening here. And let me explain what the source of my concern. So phrasing it as a worry I have, a concern I have, one way in which I'm experiencing this as not meeting that interest of being treated fairly. So you want to take it away from your you're manipulating me, and moving more into an observation. Like, here's what I'm observing. Here's the concern. And then give them a chance to explain.
A lot of this comes down to practice, right? And you talked about the five F's in the book, which I think are important for people to understand. Like, what are some of your best practices for yourself to help you practice to remain calm during a conversation, so that if you do get triggered or somebody says something that pisses you off, your body is naturally um, able to react in a way that's effective, and it's not going to lead to more tension in the conversation.
Yeah, great. Uh, Number one thing I can say on this is um, self awareness. So, really good self awareness of the emotions that are coming up in me. Instead of saying, oh, I'm not feeling angry, or I'm not feeling anxious, or I'm not feeling upset, just naming those to yourself. Um, that is so critically important. I think another really important practice that makes it a really big difference is spending the time after you have these kinds of conversations doing some kind of review with yourself. So for me, sometimes I'll actually do a little bit of journaling. And here's why that matters, Doug. If you start to do some journaling or self-reflection, you'll start to notice patterns. And the patterns help you in the moment intervene, almost the way like therapy might, like cognitive behavioral therapy. So I can tell you that for me, in general, like when people yell at me, doesn't upset me that much. I tend to often play low status. So if someone plays high status, doesn't upset me that much. But when I become really unproductive, it's when someone tries to, without justification, overlord their power on me. But that particular, and so that's the moment when I often lose it. But I wouldn't, if you would have asked me that 15 years ago, I wouldn't be able to name with that level of precision. So the more self-reflection you do, the quicker you'll be in a moment to be able to name, this is what's happening. And then as soon as you can name what's happening, it gives you more choice to just avoid one of those five F's and actually do something purposeful.
You mentioned low status and high status. And I think sometimes those terms can be misrepresented and people can feel like they're being labeled or graded. But I think there's an important lesson here, in that I think the things that people think are high status are actually low status, and the reverse is also true. Like, talk about like what it actually means to come across as being high status in a conversation.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I completely agree with you, right? That in a conversation, um, when someone is acting high status at some level, I think that's coming from a sense of insecurity, right? Deep insecurity. So high status to me, right? When someone is, for example, telling you all the amazing people that they know, or saying things like, well, Doug, when you've gotten to my stage in the career, in your career, or people of your generation, right? So there are these phrases where there's some sense trying to differentiate from you, and make you feel smaller. Because one of the things about status is that it's essentially relative. But to me, at least, phrases like that are actually indicators of insecurity. And so I think your work, if you're in the receiving end of that as much as possible, at least for me, I know this may sound counterintuitive, but from my experience, I try to go to a place of empathy.
But I do think there is, like, I guess in the context of this conversation, there are signals, I think, to let people know you have your stuff together and that you are like have like higher self-confidence, self-esteem than if you don't. Like, I think if you're more emotionally reactive in conversation, I think it gives off a vibe that you aren't necessarily quote unquote high status, and you actually like have pretty low emotional regulation skills, low emotional IQ, right? And the same can be said if you're somebody that, isn't good at, or is just talking about themselves all the time. And you're constantly like one upping, I think that kind of stuff appear like people, they may think that they're coming across as being like quote unquote high status, but to the other person and to people looking at it objectively, it's actually the opposite, right? Am I accurate there?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would distinguish confidence from status, right? I think it's very important in any negotiation, any difficult conversation, to convey a sense of confidence in what you're putting forward. And I think you do that by naming what you know and saying, this is what I know, and naming actually what you don't know. Like that, I think, builds a sense of confidence as opposed to being contingent about everything or not saying things. Status to me is a little bit, I mean, at least the way I think about status is if you need to convey status, it to me is a sign that you're not that confident, right? That you're lacking in confidence. And one of the ways people lack confidence is they say nothing. Another way in which they lack confidence is that they play a high status game. And I don't think that, to me, when I see that, I just think, yeah, like, okay, you're not that confident. And so you're needing to overplay something because you don't actually feel it yourself.
You talked about like in order to become better at negotiation and in conversation, we got to be better listeners and understand what it is that person actually wants. Like you've studied negotiation, you teach it as a career. Like other than that, what are some ways that people can understand negotiation to become more persuasive in their day-to-day life?
Yeah. So, as much as possible, right? That I think one of the most critical skills of great negotiators is perspective taking, developing the skill of understanding what does the world look like from the perspective of the person you are trying to influence, which is very different from A, what would be persuasive to you, or B, what do you think would be persuasive to lots of people? Um, because in a negotiation, this is where I think people really mess up. In a negotiation, they're often focused either on what they think they should do or what they think is persuasive or what they think many people think is persuasive, which might be fine if you're arguing before a jury. But if I'm trying to influence you, Doug, the only thing that really matters is how you see the world. And so everything I can do to try to put myself in your shoes, ask other people what you're like, read about your background, ask you lots of questions in that. I want to frame that. So, one of the things I always say is like whoever designed ambulances, I always think we're really good negotiators because on the front of most ambulances in most places in the world, it says ambulance or emergency backwards.
Really?
Yeah. If you ever look at the front of an ambulance, somebody will say emergency or ambulance backwards. And that's because whoever designed them was thinking, who am I trying to influence? Is it somebody looking at an ambulance when it's parked in the hospital parking lot? No, it's a car that's driving in front and they're looking through the rearview mirror. And if they're looking through the rearview mirror, if I want them to see the word ambulance, I got to write it backwards. Even if it looks upside down or backwards to you. And so really good negotiators are doing that same work, right? They're saying, not what does it look like to me, but who is my target? And what does it look like to them? And last thing I'll just say about this, in terms of being skillful to influence, is always giving somebody a choice that makes it easier for them to say yes. Backing someone into a wall, forcing their hand, doing a take it or leave it. You might win that day. You might win that battle on day one, but you're going to lose that war. But if you make it easy for them to say yes, as they want to say yes, that's going to have some upsides for you.
I think a lot of times when it comes to conversations and relationships, arguments, I think people are afraid of the relationship being damaged when they tell somebody no. Like, is there any kind of framework you would use with somebody when you're talking to somebody you care about and you're kind of standing up for yourself and saying no, and also kind of mitigating the risk of damaging the relationship.
Yeah. Okay. Love this. This goes back to, I think, one of the things I was saying earlier, which is this kind of reorientation about conflict. So here's what I would say. First of all, if you're so worried every time, if you there's a side of you that needs X and there's a side of you that's worried they're going to say no. Okay. Every time you don't raise it with the other person because you're afraid they're going to be disappointed, you have to remember you just disappointed the side of you that wanted to raise it. Okay. A. B. The real beauty of a no in any kind of relationship is that it actually gives some meaning to all the other yeses. The first time you say whatever it is to your significant other, no, I don't want Chinese tonight, I just want to stay in, right? Or no, I really don't want that assignment, I really want to develop this area professionally. The first time you do that is the invitation to an actual and more authentic relationship. And because our best relationships, at least from my experience, are not the ones where we always 100% agree. That's boring. And it's not real. It's just not real. So if you have to believe that the strength of a real relationship is the ability to say no, to disagree, to dissent, and still be okay. And once you can believe that, then yeses are yeses and nos are nos, as opposed to a yes is just, I'm afraid to say something to you in this relationship.
And I think when people are having conversations, one of the main goals is they're trying to charm people and get people to like them. Taking negotiating out of it, like how can you, like what's a quick hack to get people to like you when you're talking to them?
Yeah. So, the quickest hack, right, is be you, be yourself, because anything else is going to be fake. I think the other thing, though, just some more research based on this, is the value of small talk. And not endless small talk, but we know from both real life research and real life negotiations and even email negotiations that a few words about whatever, their son's soccer game, asking them how their week has been. Are you enjoying that, pot sticker you're eating right now? Right? Just greases the wheels and makes it a little bit less transactional. And those opening moments in a negotiation or an initial interaction often drive what the rest of it looks like. So small talk, being friendly, and I would just say being yourself.
I think one of the other things that people have a hard time with is dealing with narcissists, right? It's been a hot topic. I've covered it on the podcast extensively because people tend to like it. Like, how do people have conversations with narcissists?
Yeah. So let me just say on narcissism, right? Because I'm not a mental health clinician. And I think there's like the kind of mental health medical definition of narcissism, on which I probably wouldn't pontificate. And then there's I think what many of us see as narcissistic behavior, right? And on that second piece, I think I feel a little more confident offering some thoughts. And I think for me, it is a combination of trying to appeal to, frankly, the kind of self-absorbed aspect that seems to matter to them. So if it's of no cost to me and it's going to meet an interest of theirs for me to take that in and validate it, I'll do that. And also, and this is where really good preparation goes, is knowing my own interests, knowing my own boundaries, knowing my own walkaways and bottom lines. Because if I don't know that, I will become subsumed by the narcissist and like sucked into their vortex.
When people are dealing with difficult people or narcissists, I think people have a hard time because they fear being gaslit. Like, how do you define what gaslighting actually is, and how can somebody protect themselves from that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have new deep answers onto this. I mean, I think first of all, on the fear of being gaslit, um, this always to me comes down to really good preparation and knowing what are the risks of engaging, and is it worth it or not, right? So in our book, the kind of the last part of our book, we walk through, I think in a structured way, helping people understand when should they commit to continued interaction and when is it time to walk away. I think a second piece in this is being willing to name gaslighting behavior or your experience in of being gaslit without without making an accusation, but saying this is kind of how I'm experiencing it, and what is your response to that? What is your reaction to that? And sometimes inviting people to say, how would you, like, if you were in my shoes, how would you think about it? So earlier we talked about putting yourself in their shoes. I think in the face of narcissistic or gaslighting or difficult behavior, almost inviting the other side to say, how would you handle this? Or, and sometimes I'll do this, say, let me ask you this. If you were my lawyer, would you advise me to continue engaging with you?
Really putting it back on them, huh?
Yeah, put it back on them. And they'll be like, well, I'm like, no, just if you were my lawyer, because if you as my lawyer wouldn't advise me, then why are you even making that offer right now? Or why are you even suggesting this?
I think like one of the interesting things about like dealing with these high conflict personalities is sometimes people feel like they're trapped and they can't like get out of the conversation. Um, like what would be a good way to diffuse like a tense argument with someone who's clearly not able to regulate their emotions so that they don't end up giving in and caving to this other person's demands?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think if you find yourself repeatedly in a situation where you feel trapped, I think the important thing that you do before you go in is you make a pre-commitment to yourself. So I had a colleague, he was so good at this, right? He would say, when the conversation began, even, he would say, I just want to say that I pre-committed that I would not agree to anything coming out of this beyond I'll take that under counsel, or I'll give that some serious consideration. So saying, like, pre-committing to something up front, and I think the power in that is that for the other side, it's not even saying it's because you acted in a difficult way or I've gotten upset. It's just to say, as a matter of practice, I've decided I make better decisions when I engage in conversation with you or anybody, and then take some time and come back. And I think it's highly effective.
What role do you think that silence plays in conversation?
Silence can be extremely effective and powerful for a number of reasons, right? Going back to what we were saying earlier, right? That power of the pause. The silence, I think, slows the pace down. It invites both people to be, or all the people to be, a little bit more purposeful and mindful and thoughtful. It slows our brains down. It makes our brain be more purposeful. And I will also say, right, silence can be manipulated. So I think the key here is learning how to use silence and how to sit with silence so that you're not afraid of it and it can't be used against you, but actually it can be a tool for you.
And I think that, you know, the theme of this conversation, I think people who are listening to this and watching this, they're interested in using communication and conversation techniques to get more people to like them, to get more people to respect them and not be taken advantage of. Like, do you think it's possible to like train the way that people treat you, to change the way that people treat you by the way that you're choosing to communicate with them?
100%. 100%. When you convey confidence, when you are a good listener, when you show curiosity, when you show attentiveness both to your own needs and to others' needs, all of that builds respect, and makes people want to hear from you. It actually builds, I think, your trustworthiness, and your sense of integrity. So, at the heart of everything in negotiation and conflict is the belief that as individuals, we have a capacity to influence, persuade, and change others. And so, if I didn't believe that, I'd be doing some other thing with my life, not this.
How do you personally prepare? How do you personally prepare for difficult conversations or like a negotiation that you're trying to do good at?
Yeah. I mean, so I'll first spend some time thinking about like what's most important to me. Why do I even want to have this conversation? I also think about what's important to might be important to them. I'll then do some time thinking about like my own kind of emotions, what might be the triggers, what are the kinds of things I might say that would kind of knock me off balance, right? And what would well, how will I respond to that? I'll also think about what are my walkaways, right? Um, what are the kind of red lines that will make me say either I need a break or we're done entirely. And then I think the last thing I would just say is realizing, so one thing I don't do that I wouldn't suggest is scripting a difficult conversation. You can't script a conversation. You could script a play, but you can't script a conversation. You might write out some opening lines, but I wouldn't script. And so the last thing I would say is I go into it knowing that I've done some good prep, and part of the reason why this is hard is that it's called a difficult conversation. So it's not going to be perfect, and that's okay. And if the person on the other side demands that it's going to be perfect, they're probably not someone in the long term that I want to hang out with.
What do you think's an underrated communication skill that people just refuse to work on?
Uh, well, an underrated skill. I don't know if I would say they refuse to work on it, but they don't spend enough time on it. Is listening, right? I think listening in general. Most people I know think listening is a good idea. Like, there's a small, maybe 10% of people. I have come across people who say I don't really like to listen because I might be persuaded, and that makes me in a bad. If I'm persuaded, I'm less good an advocate. But that's a minority of people. Most people I know will say, "Oh yeah, listening's important." But I think most people don't invest enough time in it because I think they see it more as an obligatory speed bump to being able to advocate. But I actually think really, really good listeners, by the way, very exhausting. But those folks are, in my mind, the most skillful negotiators because they have their kind of pulse, not just on the substantive needs of the person, but also on their emotions, on their identity, on kind of what's really at the heart of what's going on. And that is what makes you able to take what seems like a zero sum negotiation and have some really breakthrough results.
I think another hidden talent that people should try to get is being able to read a room. Um, how can people read a room like instantly so they can how can people read a room instantly so they can adapt their communication to gain trust and influence?
Yeah. I think part of this is um, experience. Uh, the like putting yourself in as many possible and different situations as you can so that you can go in and get kind of a sense of the vibe. I think also when you're if you're in a room, right, having a few conversations right early on with people that you already may have some existing relationship with. And I also think, again, like some prep work. Um, like if this is a kind of space I've never been in before, or with folks I've never been in before, um, asking around, what is this like? Who are these people like? What do they react to? What's important to them? What's their culture like? All those kinds of things then um, will make me be looking for the key indicators of kind of success or not success.
Well, Bob, this has been great. Thank you so much for coming on the pod. Where can people buy the book? Where can they learn more about your work, etc.?
Yeah, Doug, thanks so much for having me. And yeah, you could buy the book. It's called Conflict Resilience: Negotiating Disagreement Without Giving Up or Giving In, at Amazon, Barnes and Noble, your local bookstore, or you can go to my website, conflictresilience.com, or my personal website, which is just bobbordone.com.
Amazing, man. Thank you so much once again for coming on the podcast.
Doug, thanks for having me.